Jess, you let me know when that thing's rolling.
It's on.
Yes.
You're live.
That noise is really energizing, actually. I like that sound. It's very, let's begin. Thank you for joining if you're here live, and thank you if you're rewatching. A little bit about getting started with podcasting, which from the many people that I've talked to, I have learned can be sort of daunting or scary, and it really shouldn't be. I'm here to tell you that podcasting is much simpler than some people lead one to believe. But essentially, it's just a digital audio file that's available for download on the internet. So if you can get past the scariness of recording your own voice and putting yourself out there and all that, really the technical side of things is pretty limited. Most of the people who are here today probably have some great ideas that they'd love to share. And so the toughest part of podcasting for some people can sort of be coming up with what are you going to talk about. But before we dig in, I would love to know what are you currently doing in education and what kind of podcast listener are you? And since there's so few of us, I don't even think we need to go in the chat. If you don't want, there's only 3, 4. If you want to just mic on and say what it is that you do in education and what kind of podcast listener you are, or type it in, and I can check the chat.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I am an IT director for a multi-academy trust of schools, so kind of the equivalent of US districts. I look after 2 primary schools and look after the IT strategy across the trust. Podcast listener. My podcasting experience as a listener started quite a few years ago, downloading and listening to a comedy sports panel show that is broadcast every Saturday here on BBC Radio 5 Live called Fighting Talk, and it's a really tongue-in-cheek comedy sport panel podcast that is an hour long, and it's kept me entertained during very many long journeys over to Dave Leonard land, where my wife is from, and so that was how I started with podcasts. And then as I got into the Twitter sphere more and started to do more ed tech stuff on Twitter, as opposed to complaining to supermarkets that my eggs were broken in the delivery, I started to. I think the first real ed tech podcast I came up across was the Edufuturist podcast, and then I met some weird person called Stephanie Howell, and she invited me to be a guest on her Get Inspired Innovate podcast. And I've started listening to a few other podcasts there, and my most recent one is one by our very own Dave Leonard as his innovator project, which is Learning Dust, which has been a great podcast.
Yeah, I remember that. That's a good segue, Dave. Thanks, Habib. I love it. I started off listening to podcasts the same way, just for entertainment purposes. But Dave.
Yeah, very similar, actually. Always started off with the entertainment, so I tended to listen to a lot of comedy podcasts, sport podcasts, and the like, and then grew into using it as a professional resource, listening to many different educational podcasts, and then was fortunate enough to attend the London Google Energizer it seems like a lot longer than about 6 months ago, in January of this year. I met a wonderful guy called David Hotler, who gave me some very timely advice, because I was contemplating starting my own podcast up at that point. So yeah, anybody who's new to this game, listen to what Dave is about to say, because it really does turn ideas into reality. Because my podcast, Learning Dust, as Abid's very kindly mentioned, is now just approaching its 12th episode, I think we're up to. So it can be real, and my number one piece of advice is just get it out there, because the one thing that I take back from that you said to me, David, more than anything else, is that your first episode will sound nothing at all like your 20th episode. So just get it out there and don't worry about it. And that was really great advice. So I'm back for more.
Appreciate it, Dave. Thanks. Summer. Do you want to hop on the mic?
And Sandy actually shared in the chat as well.
Oh, perfect. There we go. Here's made me start thinking about podcasting. Okay, beautiful. I started listening to podcasts kind of the same way, just as entertainment factor. And now I've actually really switched into, I like to consider myself like a really focused podcast listener and concentrated bursts, but I'm not very frequent. So when I decide to podcast, I'll listen to a huge range of them on a very specific topic because I really, really, really want to learn something and just get my head wrapped around something quickly. And that's when I use podcasts the most. And then if I'm looking for some inspiration, that sort of stuff, just here and there. I used to listen to podcasts a lot when I lived in the United States and I drove a car because you just find yourself driving everywhere when you live in the United States, which is kind of a bummer. Okay, 3 things that we're going to talk about today and that really, I think, drive this whole decision about making a podcast and about really putting in the time. 1, you need to really love the problem that it is that you are coming up against with your podcast and what you're trying to work on and solve. 2, it's incredibly important to be yourself, whether it's the voice that you have or the pace that you speak, or just if you're kind of silly, whoever you are in real life, that has to come through in the podcast. Otherwise, it's just not going to last. You're not going to love it. And then the last thing is that you're flying a paper airplane. And Dave touched on this just a moment ago. He said, your first episode is not going to be great. And it's not. It's not going to sound anything like the episodes that you produce later on down the road. My first episode sounded atrocious. Just adjusting the knobs like on the soundboard that I was pulling in audio from. Just doing that changed everything between episode 1 and like 5. So just experimenting too and playing around. So you're making an airplane, you're a paper airplane, you're not making a rocket ship. So the first thing that I think most podcasters tend to do is finding a big concept. And this is really like falling in love with that big problem and coming up with that very simple idea. Like, what's that thing that you want to bring to your audience? So for some of us just getting started with podcasting, like we got into podcasting because of entertainment, right? And now we say that we stay in podcasting because of the educational value, right? And so if you're looking for a niche and you're thinking of making a podcast, there's probably already a podcast about it. And so how are you going to be different than what's out there? And also, how are you going to add value to your listeners' lives? And who are your listeners, right? And so coming up really with what your big concept is sort of leads to a lot of other things, all right? And it's really like the seed that starts the whole thing. And so it's important that you really love it because you're going to stick with this for a long time, and you should assume that it's going to grow and become this wonderful big thing. And so when we're approaching trying to find out what our concept is and all of the big picture stuff, I like to use the problem tree. And this is just a protocol that you can use for sort of coming to the main problem of something. But essentially, you can make a list of the consequences or the causes of something, maybe the result of something that you're seeing out in the real world, or a problem that you're seeing, or things that seem to be causing problems. And you can work those together to try and come up with cause, problem, and consequence, and create connections between those things out in the world. And so for an example, you might see the effect of kids that are really sleepy after lunch, and we realize that the main problem there really is that they're not paying attention to my lesson after lunch. And we can realize that one of the causes of that might be having too much fatty food for their lunch, like having a pizza, right? And so we can say that having a pizza at lunch causes students to be tired, and the problem here is that they're not really paying attention. Okay, and maybe you want to write a riveting podcast all about that. So let's stop for a second here and just say, like, what's actually, I'd love to hear from Dave, just about your big concept and like what drew you into this and what called you to make your podcast. And then for anyone who's that doesn't have a podcast yet, also like think about what's drawing you to the creation of the podcast, because sometimes that can help then identify what these three things are. None of them are any more important than any of the others, but they all have this inner relationship that I'll get to here in a minute. But Dave, what called you to make your podcast?
So my podcast was born from the Google Innovator Academy in London 19, and I was, I actually pivoted onto this issue. I completely changed tack from the initial problem I started with at the academy, and I've moved on to now looking at the importance of the relationship between school technical staff, teachers, and senior leaders. So I recruited one of my friends who is a teacher and has been a senior leader. My role is technical within a school, and tried to really drill down into the issue of how we can work synergistically rather than opposing each other, and how we can have sympathy for the devil and understand these almost clashing cultures that we often see at schools. And that's really the crux of the matter for my podcast, and it's something that we focus on in every episode.
And so being intimately involved as a party within that like trifecta relationship, you were drawn to make a podcast because you saw room for improvement.
Absolutely, yes. It was something that was right at the root of my innovator journey, really. Another innovator, Ben Whitaker, came to visit me at my school and kind of said at the end of the visit, "You don't realize how unusual this is, do you, Dave? You get on with everybody as a member of IT. You're out there, you go into the classrooms." And I didn't. I just thought that was a good way of doing the job. But as I got a little bit wider experience, it became apparent that that wasn't the norm. So I kind of made it my mission to try and make it the norm to the betterment of everybody's life working in school.
That's really cool. Does anyone else want to chime in, or did anyone type in the chat? I'm sorry, I didn't have to look over. Sandy.
I mean, I don't yet have a podcast, but I've been on a guest on a few of the educational podcasts, and I think it's just reiterating what Dave has said, because our roles are quite similar, and I think the success that both he and I have seen has probably been because of the fact that we've been a bit more open to collaboration and engagement with teachers and educators, as opposed to being the stuck-up IT person who's just not wanting to be helpful and only focused on sort of the bottom line. And just like Dave said, to me it's been surprising that having that collaborative mindset is really valued by teachers, because sometimes it's a case of IT professionals sometimes behave like that because they feel that teachers and educators don't respect or care about IT. And so to see educators really appreciate the way we behave, and the way we like to inspire championing edtech and all of that impact on learning in schools is probably really great to see. And that would be, if I was doing a podcast, it'd probably end up very similar to Dave's, because that's what we just showcase and show off and celebrate all of the potential good stuff that's out there that educators might not necessarily know about.
So you're both speaking to a really important point that I made earlier, and that's simply that you need to love the problem that you're getting involved with here in your podcasting career. And so oftentimes we come across our big concept because we've been living with the causes of a problem, or we've been living with the effects of a problem, or we own the problem and we don't know how to slow the effects and the causes that are happening. And so just like the two of you are saying, there's all these intimate relationships happening in education, and sometimes just having a show where we talk about those things can be really, really helpful to people. So finding your big concept is really important. And once you've done that, you can look for your different causes and your different effects and how they relate back to that one main big problem that you keep harping on, right? That you keep coming back to over and over again, that big concept. And one of the beautiful things about the idea that a main problem can have lots of causes and lots of effects, and that each one of those causes can have different relationships with different effects, is that it makes great programming. It makes for great shows. So if you take one of those string relationships where you have an effect and its connection to the main problem, and then that effect's connection to a cause, that is the structure for a great episode. So in your hook, you might mention the effect, right, as a way of gaining your audience's attention. So you might say something like, have you ever noticed that your kids tend to fall asleep right after lunch and recess? What's that about? Well, on today's show, we're going to talk with an expert all about nutrition, sleep, and how it might affect our students' learning. Stay with us today for an episode on Dave's podcast. Right? So we got a nice hook. We're talking about the effect, and we're ready to get our listeners engaged, right? And we can tie it all back into the thesis right after we come back from our little stinger hook there and just say something like, so as many of you know, on the show, Dave's podcast, we're constantly looking at what affects student performance in the classroom. And today we're delighted to have our guest speaker, Harley, my dog, talk about nutrition in the classroom and how important it is for math scores, right? And then my guest is going to come on and they're going to talk all about the cause, and they're going to talk about nutrition, and we're going to speak lots of truths. And you can see that big arrow there that's sort of leading to action. And this is where your podcast should sort of have more to it than, unless it's just the entertainment factor, and then the call to action is probably get on our mailing list, or sign up for our YouTube channel or something along those lines. And that might be your call to action too. But it's important to really end with a call to action, especially if it's a similar one that you tend to use each week, because your main problem has a main call to action. Right? So in the chat there, if you are so inclined, a great exercise is to look at this cause and effect and its relationship to the main problem, tease out one of them, and either pitch an episode, or if you're following along after the fact, you can even pitch your main problem. So, I mean, you just said, I don't have a podcast, but if I had one, it would be this. So you can think about this tool as actually a way of finding that main concept for your show. And if you already have a main concept, you can use the problem tree protocol for coming up with lessons, or excuse me, not lessons, episodes that you might use on your actual show. But if you're following along live or in the recording, think about what is a good hook, what is an effect within your podcast domain, what's a thesis, or what's your main problem, and then what's that cause, or what's that truth, and a potential call to action. And this should be quick. You should be able to jump on pretty quick. And if you're going to come on the mic, Dave, if you want to talk about a previous episode, that'd be cool. And Abid, if you were thinking, well, all right, let me give this a shot. If I were going to make a podcast, here's what I would do, and take 2 minutes and see if you can come up with one. Oh, and we have a new listener. Dr. Jackson, welcome. Thank you for joining. We're talking about the hook and how it relates to the main problem, and then the cause of an episode or of the sort of the main concept or driving concept behind our podcast. And in the chat right now, we're just brainstorming some of the things that might look like problems, causes, and effects, and sort of how we can tie those things together to make either an episode or maybe like a 15-second preview for our particular show that we want to produce, the podcast that we want to produce or the podcast that we do produce. Does anyone want to get on and take a shot at doing like an elevator pitch?
Or David, just a quick question. Sandy, I think you actually answered her question just now with the recommended time of each section and the overall time to engage the audience without losing them. I heard you just say 15 seconds. Is that kind of what we're looking at?
What? I'm sorry. There was a question, or?
Oh yeah, Sandy said she asked about the recommended time of each section. I think each of those things, how long should the hook, the main problem?
Oh, I see. Okay. So that's a great question, and I think it depends a little bit upon the type of show format that you have, Sandy. And I haven't gotten there just yet. I haven't really talked a little bit about like the different ways that you can present this scenario, this hook, thesis, truth, action playbook, if you will. But it really depends, like if you're a long form interview style podcast, this part here that happens in the middle, this thesis truth piece, that could be a 45-minute interview that you have with someone. But if you're a quick show where you want to engage teachers with 10, 12 minutes and you want to be done quick, this could be you pretty quickly going over the latest news and talking about some of the latest research and just giving it to us straight in 12 minutes kind of thing. And so how much time you spend on each thing, I think, is kind of dependent upon how much do you have to say, and is it worthy of your audience's time? So really value their time and put together some really quality stuff. And if you wouldn't listen to it, don't assume anyone else would. Let me go back to the chat. Okay, so Dr. Jackson, you're saying liking to start with a question, which I think is a great way of hooking people. And I think it's also a fantastic way of piquing their curiosity, and it just sets you up for a great statistic, right? Like just in a moment you can answer that question with a fantastic stat or something that you can throw in to keep them engaged, or that really leads into the thing that you want to talk about. Pressure and lack of flexibility to try new things for fear of unnecessary rocking the boat. Okay, so that can be sort of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This mindset, this old school mindset as a main concept or problem, I think that's huge. Yeah, I hear all the time, well, that's just the way we've always done it, and maybe that podcast's name is called like Breaking the Wheel or Breaking the Cycle. Dave, I see you turn your mic off. You want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to save you there, David, because you were you'd asked for somebody to speak and nobody had done. So,
oh, sure. Yeah.
I'm more than happy to pitch in with my kind of theory behind that. So for Learning Dust, our hook is that teachers see techies as blockers, techies see teachers as security vulnerabilities, and leaders see these behaviours as obstacles to high quality learning experiences. So I've got the main problem down as being that the people in each of these roles don't understand the pressures that their colleagues are under. And therefore the truth is that it's mutually beneficial to spend time getting to know each other's roles. And the call to action would be get out of your bubble, listen to each other, and work out ways in which you can help each other to the benefit of the learners, which is ultimately why we're all going to school every day, isn't it?
Dave, that's fantastic. I mean, that I think as a call to action and I feel engaged and excited to hear an episode and hear sort of everyone's side of the story kind of thing. I can almost It almost sounds like it would be people getting on and being like, yeah, but you know, like, think about it from my perspective. What would happen if you had come to me last minute and I had asked you for this thing? You know, like a lot of truth coming out in one of those episodes, I feel like. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And you know, we tried to mix it up by bringing different guests in from each of those different perspectives, or quite often our guests have done all three of those roles, and that becomes really interesting then to get their understanding. And we just try and keep that whole thing as the core sort of platform for the discussion, and then bring different guests in each week to mix up the conversation and gain from their experiences and their insights.
And I think, yeah, that's a great just segue. And I'm going to mention it now before I take questions. But before I get into some of the technical stuff, if you want to take a minute, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk here about show formats really quick. And then I'm going to take kind of a pause in the middle to answer any questions that anyone has about anything that I've talked about before I get into some of the more technical, techie side of stuff. Sometimes I feel it's better to sort of separate the two and answer any questions about the concept stuff before I get into the technical stuff. But Sandy, you had asked that question, and Dave just mentioned it there. He said we sort of have this consistent format. We bring people on, we talk to them. It sticks to a rhythm, and I would say that that's sort of, once you have that concept, once you understand what some of your episodes will look like, now is when you sort of fit that into a show type or a show format that you then can understand and produce, right? And so we have like the classic interview style show where you have a central host that people come onto the show, they interview the expert, they reveal great things to us, very Terry Gross, fresh air, that sort of thing. You've got conversational where you have consistent hosts. This is very Joe Rogan show, where you probably have guests, but you also probably have hosts that are always on, that are sort of always having similar conversations, that have these personalities. You have educational where you might be, it might be quick and to the point, and you're just feeding us information, just one person. I've seen solo casts where it's just very like free flowing thought of someone just talking. There's nonfiction storytelling that even happens, which is a beautiful type of podcasting that takes place. And then there's fictional storytelling, and a multitude of others. Of course, there's no limit to these. This is just some of the ones that I've looked up. But when you figure out what you want, you know, go listen to 3 or 4 episodes of a popular show and listen from the technical standpoint of like, how is this show broken down? If I were going to write this out and put it towards my format, like, listen to the show as if you were trying to write an outline, you know, before you really dig into the technical side of stuff. Maybe have a few scripts written out so you really understand how the show is going to flow and that sort of thing, because it really answers a lot of questions when you get into the technical side of like, what kind of equipment do I need? Well, if you picked, you know, like a conversational show that has multiple hosts, you might want to consider having some kind of like online recording software where you can all get together and chat. But, you know, if you pick something like non-fictional storytelling, you might consider investing time and effort into finding some really great duty-free, royalty-free sound effects and that sort of stuff, or figure out, you know, some of that type of thinking. So just thinking through those little pieces are all really helpful. Does anyone have any questions? You can either put them in the chat or jump on before I move through.
Dr. Jackson.
Okay.
There, a burning question. How do you keep? Do you have topics already decided in advance?
Well, I think too, Dr. Jackson, that can be dependent a little bit just upon your show type and your format, and also what it is that you are, your main problem and your big main concept. And so, if you're a conversational show about all things education, and your problem really is just that teachers need a little bit of laughter in their life, chances are you have a calendar for your show and you're looking into the future and saying, oh, well, September episodes should probably be kind of back to school-y. You know, in October, we might talk about a seasonal holiday, or we might talk about getting ready for the flu. And then in November, we might talk about burnout. or preparing for long breaks or assessments. So obviously, there's always room for looking into the future and saying, what could we talk about that's going to be relevant and timely down the line? But Dr. Jackson, don't count your chickens before they hatch, because you just never know when your 3-month plan gets wrecked because something happens in your country that's huge and crazy, and you have to stop everything and address that first. Or a global pandemic hits the world. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Maybe that's a good idea. That changes the face of how education works. I don't know. Maybe you talk about that too. So there's a little bit of planning that happens, and there's a little bit of like, hey, stay flexible, stay agile. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm actually in the middle of a pivot. I started a podcast last fall, and it was called Stories on a Train. And as my husband and I traveled around on a train, we met all kinds of people. And I thought, wouldn't this be a great idea? Because I just love listening to, you never know who you're going to sit with at dinner, and you never know who you're going to end up talking to. So I started this podcast, and I got 5 episodes in, and then something happened on the way to the pandemic, so I'm thinking maybe I could take that idea and do a memories of people of train travel or something like that, because I still think it's a good premise, but obviously I can't travel around on trains anymore. So
yeah, and that's a real bummer.
So I don't know if I should just scrap it, start over, or pick it up later, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and so part of what I'm hearing you say is that some of the solutions that you have found for getting the stories on trains that you want to produce, those solutions aren't available to you anymore. And so if we look back at the problem at hand, it was, I want to talk to people while I travel, or do I want to be on a train? Like, how important is the train factor? How important is it that it's a story? How important is it that you're live with the person? And really like drill down into what the actual problem is that you want to help your listeners solve, and see if there's another way that maybe you can just temporarily help solve them, and just say like, we are stories from trains during a pandemic, right? And so like, we're not actually on a train, and we're not actually traveling, and we're staying at home, and just address it for what it is. And then suspension of disbelief. Okay, we popped up, our snap cams, and now we are on a train, and we're having this great conversation. And you can, I think you can run with that. But I think it takes a little bit of, again, what's my big concept, and am I staying true to that? Because while it's really, it can be guiding early on, later when things are growing and you're getting bigger and you're making new decisions, it's also guiding then, because you can say, well, that kind of steers us away from the reason that we started this whole thing, And so having that and truly understanding what it is that you want, your big concept is, I think is important. And if it's all dependent upon you being on a train and telling stories, then maybe, now's the time to pause. But if it's really about having deep conversations with people, I think you can keep doing that.
Okay. All right. I'm only 5 episodes in, so
yeah.
I'm pretty excited. That gives me a good idea of really evaluating what the whole purpose of it is. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And no matter what you do, just don't stop. Yeah. So keep going.
Okay. All right.
So here's some more of the technical side of things. So you've got this concept, you've got your ideas laid out, maybe you've got a few episodes scripted out. You're going to need some audio resources. Just hearing your voice can get dull. And if you listen to the great podcasts of our day and age, they all have intro music, and they have stingers and sound effects, and they have sound transitions. And so I highly recommend that you check this out. there's actually a link for my presentation in the chat. It's view only, that has links to all of these. But if you Google any one of these, they'll pop up. And these are great places to go and find cheap or free with attribution style, some of them, you know, absolutely attribution and royalty free stuff that you can use and stitch together and make your own little intro-y sounds and things. You can also hop on Fiverr and people will make you one for next to nothing. So think that through as well. If you wanted to get your own custom little zinger pack with your own custom sounds and things like that, you could always hire out and have that made, but you don't have to. It's so easy. Every one of these resources just has tons of stuff to choose from for you coming up with background music and all of that. So once you start putting it together, you have to get it out there. So really, this is the way this thing works. I said before, a podcast is a file that's available for download on the internet. Well, that file has to sit and actually live somewhere, and that's your host. So from this first column, you have to get the MP3 file to actually be somewhere on the internet so that it is available for download, and it's not going to get blocked by like firewalls. So like Google Drive isn't going to work because Google Drive isn't going to just let some third-party app access it and download it. You have to use the Google Drive client to do that, right? So these products, Libsyn, Stitcher, SoundCloud, they all have services that let you essentially host a podcast, because it's more than just uploading your file somewhere. You're essentially creating an RSS feed, all right? An RSS feed is what blogs have lived on for a long time, but essentially an RSS feed is simply something that broadcasts the latest update from a source, right? And this source is your podcast. And the update is simply the latest episode title, description, file for download, and all of the other little details that the publisher requires. And so you have to have somewhere that's going to put all of that together for you. All you really need is an RSS feed. You could write that yourself in a text editor. I don't recommend doing that because it has to be perfect for things like iTunes and Spotify. And that's why I recommend using something like Libsyn, which is short for Liberated Syndication. This first one here at the top, they're like $5 a month. And it's like getting online and there's just a form. And it says, what's your title? What's your long description? What's your short description? What's the episode photo? What's all of your stuff? And you set all of that up. And then you can publish your episodes. And basically you go to Libsyn or Stitcher or Anchor or whatever, and you publish it there. And then it pushes to your RSS feed. And then the publishers like Google Podcasts and iTunes and Spotify, they get your new episode because you published it to your RSS feed. That kind of sounds confusing, but think about it like radio. You go into the radio broadcast studio, you broadcast, and then all of the other places pick it up because they have their little antenna sticking out waiting for it, right? And then most podcasts have also a website to help represent them. Most podcasters do a blog for their show. They might include the transcript or just like a script of what they talked about. Many times they include other resources or links that they talked about. So again, this is sort of the technical roadmap for getting the episode online once it's edited. But you also have to technically do something to it. And this is the step that I think really throws a lot of people off, because technical editing can be technical and it can also freak people out. I'm here to tell you that editing is pretty simple. You just take out the parts that you don't want and you leave the parts that you do, and you slap a little music on the front end of it. One of the softwares that I recommend is the Soundtrap, which is a completely online-based editing service that you can use. It's also mobile and a desktop version, which is fantastic. If you're going to purchase a microphone, the first microphone that I suggest you use for your podcast is the one that I'm using in this, which is just the basic old Apple headphones. The mic is great. It's a condenser mic, but it's small and right next to my face. You don't want, if you're on Amazon or something and you're looking around, do not buy a dynamic microphone. Dynamic microphones are used for capturing crazy loud noises in big open spaces. And you want a condenser mic, which is for smaller noises and smaller condensed spaces. So it's just a little less sensitive. That's the kind of mic that you would want to use to record your voice. And if you are using your new condenser mic, you can edit and record all at the same time using something like Soundtrap. When I recorded a podcast, I actually used an iPhone. So I recorded all of the audio to the iPhone. So I did an interview show with people. And what I would ask them to do is we would have a WhatsApp video call with one another, simply just like we're doing now. And what I would ask them to do is just take out your phone, please. And I would ask them to open their voice memo app and set the phone down just on the laptop right in front of them and hit record. And I would do the same exact thing. And then we would just have a normal conversation through the Google Meet or whatever it is that we were meeting with. And at the end, I would say, okay, hit press stop recording and upload that file to Drive. And it's a little MP3 file. But you'd be amazed at how great that audio file is because it's right there in front of them. Phones are designed to have nice microphones to pick up audio that's about this far away from your mouth. It was really great. And then I just took those two MP3 files and I used software kind of like Soundtrap to line them up. And then once they're lined up, you just kind of go through it. You cut out the chunks where you don't want things and hit export. And it actually worked out really, really well. So that's some of the more technical stuff. There's also a ton of people available that want to edit your podcast for money. So if you're someone who doesn't want to do it technically yourself, again, you can get on things like Upwork.com or Fiverr. There's probably a student at your school who is a fantastic sound editor and wants to get involved with your project. So you might also talk to them. There's no money that you need to get involved with this. Really, there is a free way of doing this all the way up the line. That might mean that you have to have an ad somewhere in there for the freemium version of something. The next most expensive option, you're talking maybe 5 to 12 a month for the hosting and things like that. That if you want to just pay for it to be easier, and then you can really just throw tons of money at this if you wanted to buy a bunch of mics and fly your guests around the world and whatever, you can go crazy. If you're familiar with the Innovator program, you'll know about the Advocacy Playbook. These are two people that helped write that, and these are some of their suggestions for starting a podcast. And I went in through and just sort of bolded some of the ones that I think really stand out. The first one there, I've mentioned it before, but again, this whole thing has to energize you. It has to give you life. Number 10 there from Alan is to socialize with other podcasters. And you'd be amazed at how many other podcasters want to have you on their show and they want to be on your show, and you can sort of cross-pollinate your shows, if you will. YouTubers do that all the time. They're from Rhett. Number 5, preparation makes perfect. This is so true. One of the shows that I used to produce was completely scripted. We were actually reading from a script, but we actually practiced reading the script so that it didn't sound like we were reading, which took some effort, but the quality of the show sounded phenomenal. I mean, it sounded like we were having a really nice conversation. In the other show that I would produce, I would have a 30-minute call with my guest before, and we would just have a casual conversation, and then we would record basically the second call, which seems redundant, but it was always better than the first call. And then number 9 there is invest in the tools of the trade. And I say this hesitantly, don't let that be what stops you from creating your first recording, because as we talked about before, your first one's probably not going to be that great. So don't worry about it. They're going to get so much better, and you're going to buy a new microphone, and you'll have new editing software, and you'll grow into the show that you produce. So thank you for coming. Thank you for everyone who participated, asked questions. I'd love to hear any final questions that anyone has. I've been using WeVideo. Oh, cool. I didn't know they realized that they had a podcast template. Okay. How much of a problem is it to move hosts? Libsyn is okay, but the cost mounts up quickly. So basically, Dave, what's going to happen is that you need to go to all of your publishers and change your RSS feed, and then they have to approve your RSS feed. So you should be able to do that in the settings of your podcast. It's not surmountable, but it might mean a lapse in your podcast service while they authenticate your new feed. I know iTunes is like super picky about the authentication of the RSS, and they could take some time to get back to you. And so that would be the only thing that I would caution you about, is simply that you might lose some connection. And then I would recommend posting all of your old episodes on your new hosting service, because when you stop paying for your old hosting service, those episodes are no longer available on the publisher's page, even if they show them there as a record. So just as an example, let's say you switch services today. If I search for Stardust episode 2, the publishing service is directed to a link to the hosting service that you're no longer paying for, and thus the file is no longer there. So what you might need to do is go back and repost in your new publishing service all of your old episodes so that they can show up as new records in the RSS feed. Oof, that's messy, but yeah. Oh, wow. That was not the case for me when I was looking, but it has been 3 years since no, 2 years since I've had to deal with trying to get an RSS feed picked up by these publishers. Dr. Jackson, do you have any questions about some of the technical stuff? I went over them relatively quickly because usually I don't have the kind of time that it would take. I could do a session just about editing audio, if we needed. Like I could talk about any of these technical things in depth if you wanted to hear more, for sure. And any other questions that anyone had. You saying, Dr. Jackson, about using WeVideo is a really great, it's just never a bad idea to record the video that's happening, everyone who's making podcasts.
Yeah.
Record yourself, have them record themselves, or record the call that you're on. As these things grow, just put it on YouTube. It's just more hits. It's just more opportunities to be noticed. You know, even if the recording of your show happens as a live broadcast, because then you can just be done and export as audio, and then you have all the audio. So one of the examples there is that you could use like StreamYard is a service that you can use, and they don't host your podcast, but you can download just the audio. I don't know. I'm rambling. Dr. Jackson, what's up?
That's what you make the video, you have the conversation, and you can choose either to finish it as a podcast or finish it as a video. So you still have the record of the video. So you can do both actually, and you can export to YouTube as well.
Okay.
So yeah, and then Anchor did all that stuff for me. They put it on other, once I had my free Anchor account, they put it on Apple or wherever. They did all that verification stuff for me.
Yeah.
So that was pretty cool. I recommend Anchor because it was easy. You can
Right.
actually record it all through them and just click record and click publish, and they'll publish and send it to other hosting services, I guess. I don't know much of the technical stuff. I like the editing and I like the sound effects and that kind of stuff.
Then like that's the cool thing too. Like Soundtrap, I think even has their own, like, they might even have hosting services for podcasts now. So you can just leave it all on their stuff. And sometimes when you're paying, like Dave, you were saying, the costs can add up. Sometimes if you're just paying for that one service, you get access to their royalty-free music, you get access to their editing platform, their recording platform, and their hosting platform. It can start to look like a lot, but then you realize you're not paying for a lot of some of these other things.
Yeah, it's when the episodes are long that becomes a problem, because it's based on storage space, isn't it? The hosting. So
yeah.
If you've got large files, I found I've already had to go up sort of 2 levels in the hosting prices. So I started off on like you said, the the $5 a month package, the basic. But it really quickly became apparent that for long episodes, that was nowhere near sufficient. So I'm up to sort of $20-30 a month now. Because otherwise I can't release more than 2 episodes a month.
Right. Yeah, they go file size, don't they?
Yeah. So that's what I was just wondering whether you'd come across any, because it almost feels a little dated. And that was the other final question that I'd asked as well, because I noted when you spoke to me before about, you said that feed burner was an important thing to put in there. And it almost looked as though that had closed down in 2012 when I looked at feed burner.
Yeah. Feed burner is not as relevant as it was. And I tell you, when I first started podcasting, and even when I was even in the middle of it, the RSS feed part is so important. Like, they're really picky about that. And FeedBurner used to be a nice way of authenticating, and as well as you could put some analytics into your RSS feed to get some more information that would see, because what can happen is that iTunes will only give you so much information, and then you also don't know if you're out in 5 different publishers, there's no one place you can go to get analytics on your podcast. Like, sometimes I listened but I didn't download, or sometimes I listened online so I didn't need to download, or sometimes I subscribed and downloaded but it never got listened to. And so what FeedBurner would do was, basically, you have one RSS feed that goes through FeedBurner and then it goes out to all these other places, and it would allow me to get analytics about my podcast without having to go to all the different publishers and then rely on what they were willing to give me for data. But it's with the uptick and like rise in the popularity of podcasts, they're not going to do anything with it. It's dead. So I took it out of the slideshow. Thanks for bringing it up.
Thanks. I think it was still in the slide deck. That's why I brought it up, because I thought I missed it last time you spoke to me about it. So no, that's great. Thank you. I now don't feel as though I'm missing something.
Does anybody have any more questions? I really appreciate everyone for your time. It's very July. No, it's just a quiet, slow July. So thanks for coming and for joining. You can always email me or chat to me any questions you might have. If you want me to have a listen to your first show or give you any feedback, or if you're looking for a guest on your show, I'm always happy to be a guest on shows. I love being on podcasts. And there's the Mr. Andrew. How are you, sir?
Good, thank you. I was just coming in to say thank you, and thank you for your session today. I'm also going to stop the recording now in case any more questions coming in, so we can get the video pushed across. I'll stop the recording now.
It was my pleasure.